Sapphic and Spiritual, a podcast for queer spirituality, because being queer is a spiritual path, with your host, Carly Phillips. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, and happy Pride Month. How's everyone doing? It's been an interesting 24 hours here in my household. The cat distribution service decided to make a surprise visit last night. My wife was taking out our dog and she called me to come outside because there was a kitten in our yard. What a smart kitten. Picking the house with the pride flag hanging outside. She was like, lesbians, yes, those suckers. I found my home. So we already have a dog and a cat, but of course we brought her inside and we have her in kitty quarantine until we get her checked out. The neighbor said that she's been wandering. She's probably like 6-7 weeks old. Poor baby without her mama. She's so cute. So I'm on standby waiting to hear back from the vet to see if they can squeeze her in today. So it's a zoo. It's a zoo in my house. And of course, I waited until the last minute to record this episode. So if at any point you hear any strange noises, that's why. My dog is freaking out trying to break in and see this kitten. I think my editing will take care of that, but you never know. So I'll keep you posted. I'm trying to convince my wife that we should keep her. Don't you think? You can never have too many cats. Just my opinion. But anyway, back to the episode, back to why we're here. So today we're talking about pride, revolutionary optimism, and we'll have a bit of a history lesson today in honor of Pride Month. We'll explore movements and LGBTQ activists who made significant impacts on our community that we can look to for a sense of inspiration and hope as we continue to fight for liberation, not only for our community, but for all. So if you're anything like me, Pride Month may be feeling a little bit different this year. I'm not going to lie, the overall state of the world hasn't quite put me in a celebratory mood. In fact, it's felt a little bit self-indulgent to me, and I felt guilty in a sense to even be considering celebrating much of anything right now, to be honest, while the world sits back and just allows for genocide to happen. And then on top of that, here in the US this week, we have someone who's been convicted of 34 felonies, a conviction that strips many from the right to vote, yet you can still become president. So just sitting here with the reality of a sociopathic, far-right convicted felon or another geriatric war criminal using taxpayer money to fund genocide being the two top picks to lead our country. What fucking timeline are we in? Like, how is this our reality? How did we get here? Like, am I the only one that asks myself these questions? I can't be. So yeah, call me a Debbie Downer, but I haven't felt the same level of excitement for Pride Month that I have in the past. And I think in some ways it's a good thing, or maybe it's at least the truth, because it means we're not just disassociating from the realities of the world. And there's also this piece linked to not wanting to buy into the capitalistic portion of Pride, like buying all the Pride merch and seeing companies change their logo to Pride colors despite not actually showing any real support or solidarity for our community. It's performative, right? I mean, look at Target choosing to only have their Pride collection at select stores. That sends the message that it's never been about supporting the LGBTQ community, which, I mean, not like that's new information, but it proves that it's about profiting off of our community. And when there's a potential risk of losing profits because of the pushback from conservatives, companies like Target will always choose the side of profit over people. But somewhere in my feelings of doom and gloom about the state of the world, I came across a TikTok on my For You page this week from a brilliant Palestinian student at Pal Folklore. I'll link in the show notes. And this really made me rethink my pessimistic thinking I've been having lately. So she talks about the concept of revolutionary optimism, which is a term that's new to me. So essentially, revolutionary optimism is an idea that stresses the importance of hope and optimism regarding the potential for revolutionary change. From my understanding when researching this term, this optimism is rooted in collective confidence and the ability of people, particularly the oppressed, to overthrow oppressive systems and build a more just society. So in the TikTok I'm referencing, the creator talks about revolutionary optimism being viewed as a spiritual obligation for Palestinians. That never losing sight of the hope that Palestine will be liberated is the driving force that keeps them going. She says, it's not just a concept for Palestinian people, it's a way of life. They then go on to talk about a post made by the National Students for Justice in Palestine, where they talk about revolutionary optimism. And it's such a powerful post. I'm going to read what they say, but go check it out on Instagram at NationalSJP. They say, it is our duty to remain optimistic and commit to the belief and surety that Palestine will be liberated. Our daily commitment is psychic alignment. We must name every single process that allows revolutionary moments. This prevents us from commodifying despair and defeat. Powerful, right? And if that's not powerful enough, they also posted a quote from Palestinian poet Rashid Hussein, who said, "Don't be sad, darling. To put me in prison as they did is a very easy thing. But what can they do about the sun shining outside and nurturing new rebels?" Wow. There is just so much power in all of that. Learning about revolutionary optimism and continuing to hear of the unshakable resilience and spirit of the Palestinian people, and then reading the words of Rashid Hussein, I felt this light of hope turn back on. The way the TikTok creator described revolutionary optimism as a spiritual obligation, just incredible. It gave me full body chills to have this concept be so embodied. This goes beyond just being an idea that can be applied to movements of social change and justice. When embodied, revolutionary optimism is a vision keeper. It's the container of hope. It's what unites us and the very mechanism that allows for the human spirit to keep moving forward despite the darkness that we encounter. It breeds resiliency. It's the opposite of nihilism. It's what feeds the movement and what enables progress. Without revolutionary optimism, the oppressor stays in power. We believe we have nothing to fight for. One of the hardest spiritual concepts, I believe, to really grasp as humans is the idea of duality and integrating the polarity, right? This idea that both the shadow and light, or that two opposing realities or beliefs can still be present and exist at the same time. It's so hard for us to understand because we live in a world built upon polarization. It's all we've been taught, night and day. Man and woman, black and white, right and wrong, when the reality is it's never that cut and dry. People really struggle with moving away from duality. I mean, look at the opposition and hate directed towards trans and non-binary folks. There are people who simply cannot fathom the idea that gender is more complex than just man and woman. So when Rashid Hussein said, "To put me in a prison is easy, but what can they do about the sun shining and nurturing new rebels?" That is the ultimate testament to living within that duality, that despite living in an open-air prison, the sun is shining, there are lives waiting to be touched, community to be formed. I just don't even have the words when I think about the resiliency and bravery and wisdom and soul evolution that one would have to come to get to this conclusion. It's remarkable and truly, I feel like it's one of the most inspiring sentences I've ever read. To think about the suffering this Palestinian poet endured throughout his life, and for him to say, you know what? They can't take away the fact that the sun is shining. I'm alive today. And because of that, because there's air to breathe and sun above me, I'm going to have hope. I'm going to inspire future rebels and leaders. You can't take that away. Profoundly beautiful and inspiring. This is the personification of revolutionary optimism. So after a few days of sitting with this idea of revolutionary optimism, it brought me back to the why in terms of pride, why we celebrate pride. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the famous quote by the incredible activist Marsha P. Johnson, "No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us." And before revolutionary optimism came into my awareness this week, I was thinking about this quote and completely placing a different meaning on it. I felt like, well, people are suffering, so why should we celebrate? But now I see it as people are suffering, so there's even more of a reason to celebrate, to not only celebrate us, but to celebrate and honor and bring awareness to them, to celebrate the vision of liberation for all, and to show those who wish to oppress us that we aren't going anywhere, that suffering can exist, and yet simultaneously, the joy of who we are and the hope that lives within the vision we hold of freedom for all, liberation for the LGBTQ community, for Palestine, for Sudan, for Haiti, for Congo, for all who experience oppression. There's joy and hope and celebration in that vision of liberation, in revolutionary optimism. And I think it's important to remember that there's more than one way to celebrate pride. We see this with all holidays or celebration that capitalism loves to use these celebrations as a way to make money. So we all buy the rainbow stuff. And no shade here. I wore a shirt from last year that said, "Busy thinking about girls," and Vans that had the pride flag and trans flag on them on June 1st at my local pride event. But the point I'm getting at here is that part of why pride was feeling off to me this year with what's happening in Palestine. It's that I'm so much more aware now, more than ever, of how harmful these systems actually are. And I don't want to be a part of them. I want to distance myself as much as I possibly can from capitalism. But the truth is, capitalism can't ruin pride. Capitalism isn't pride. Pride goes beyond capitalism. Pride isn't just rainbows, parades, and glitter. Pride isn't a day or a month, but a lived experience, a form of resistance to systems that shun us. It's activism. Pride is divine expression of self, and at its core, pride is all about radical love, radical self-love, and radical love for others. Pride as a movement is all about promoting equality, dignity, and respect for all. And what better time than now to celebrate that? For us as the queer community, pride is our revolutionary optimism in action. If you're listening to this podcast, you've probably seen the posts going around saying things like, "Queer liberation is Palestinian liberation." And this is why. If one of us is under attack, we're all under attack. We can't have a free and liberated world until freedom and liberation is bestowed upon everyone. So it's important to celebrate pride and to honor those who fought for our freedom and our rights, especially at a time like now because it's all connected. You might be listening like, "I thought this podcast was about queer spirituality. Why do you keep talking so much about activism? What does that have to do with spirituality?" Well, it has everything to do with spirituality. One of the core principles of spirituality is this concept of oneness, that all beings are interconnected and fundamentally united. It's the recognition that beneath the surface of individual differences and experiences, there's a shared essence of unity, that there's this collective consciousness that runs through all of us. It's like the concept of the drop of water within the entire ocean, or the individual tree within the overall forest. Let's take the forest, for example. So we know that individual trees help one another to benefit the overall health of the forest as a whole. So within this relationship between the tree root systems and fungi, trees share nutrients and resources. They send chemical signals to each other to warn of threats like pest infestation or diseases. Trees are interdependent, and they know that it's about the health of the whole forest, not just the individual tree. So we humans don't have physical roots that create the interconnected web in the way trees do, but we're still just as connected through the collective consciousness. It weaves us all together. And so no different than a forest, if one family of trees is suffering, we need to pool our resources together to help because the well-being of the forest is dependent on it. It's at risk. It doesn't matter how healthy we are individually if the rest of the forest is sick. So if you're the tree who has the resources, who's standing tall and strong, you share it because the health of the forest depends on it. And that's how queerness, activism, spirituality, working for the liberation of all comes together. Right now, hope is one of the most important resources we can share if we have it, because in the absence of hope, there's no movement forward. I had this download the other day that whoever suggested that we hold on to hope, that saying like, hold on to hope, yeah, they were wrong. Hope wasn't designed to be held. Hope was always meant to be released. Hope is a gift that must be shared. Hope is that idea of revolutionary optimism right now. It's about honoring those who came before that held the vision and about continuing to keep that vision alive. So in honor of Pride Month, I'd like to take the time to bring light to activists and movements that paved the way for us. In their stories of resilience, we can find hope. And that's the nourishment we need. That's the fuel we need to keep us moving forward. As we explore queer activism, it's important to keep in mind the interconnectedness of movements, right? So it's about learning from these earlier movements and incorporating elements of what worked and modifying and changing what's in it. For example, there's a really good documentary on Tello called Once a Fury, which looks at the Furies Collective. And this was a collective of 12 women in the early 70s who were lesbian feminists and political activists who published a national newspaper called The Furies in 1972 that aimed to create a separate women's movement for lesbians because they believed the women's movement as a whole was oppressive towards lesbians. And they believed that to be a lesbian was more politically based than even sexuality based. They believed in decentering men and rejecting heteronormativity to combat patriarchy and change the overall political landscape. So while this all sounds wonderful, one of the things that they bring up in the documentary is the lack of representation of women of color within their movement. So anytime we're diving into history, any kind of history or herstory, I think it's important to critically evaluate what's happened and to remember that while these movements may pertain to what we see as separate causes, all fights for liberation from a spiritual lens is interconnected. And when we fail to see that, or include that truth in what we're working to change, we're doing a massive disservice to the movement. Underneath it all, we're fighting for freedom to live in peace and to be free of persecution, and joining forces brings more power to the cause, whether it's for LGBTQ rights or fighting for a free Palestine. So let's dive into some queer history, shall we? So we're going to start in the 1950s within the context of the United States, but clearly we've always been here. It just takes more digging the further back in time you go because of the secrecy that came with being LGBTQ+, as a way to stay safe in the world during a time when homosexuality was seen as a mental health condition and criminalized in many places. So if you go all the way back to episode 2, the witch episode, we talked about the Lavender Scare, and this is a good place to start when we're looking at the modern Pride movement as we know it today. So since we've already talked a bit about the Lavender Scare, the recap is that in the US in 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower passed Executive Order 10450, which allowed for queer people to be investigated and removed from positions within the federal government because of the mainstream belief that being gay or lesbian was a moral character flaw. And this really went hand in hand with the Red Scare of the 1950s that spread fear related to the threat of communism. So the government was essentially looking for scapegoats to basically sell their propaganda as they do, and they targeted the queer community. As a result of the Lavender Scare, it's estimated that between 5,000 and 10,000 people lost their government jobs. So queer people were really being targeted, and we start to see what's referred to as the rise of the homophile movement. So the term homophile was used to describe individuals and organizations that advocated for the rights and acceptance of homosexuals and sought to challenge anti-gay discrimination and stigma. The term homophile was used to emphasize love, So phile coming from philia, meaning love, rather than sex, in an attempt to desexualize queer people, making the movement more about love versus sex or sexuality. So within the homophile movement, we see two organizations pop up, the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. And they were key players in this movement that advocated for social acceptance, legal protection, and decriminalization of homosexuality. The Mattachine Society came first. It was founded in 1950 by Harry Hay and a group of other gay men who were community organizers and activists in Los Angeles. The society was named after medieval French secret societies called Mattachines that were known for their masked dances, which to Harry Hay symbolized the hidden nature of gay life at the time, living with this masked identity, which is so relatable. The organization aimed to protect and improve the rights of gay men and lesbians, to educate the public about homosexuality, and support individuals in the gay community who face discrimination and harassment. In 1952, one of the founding members, Dale Jennings, was arrested for lewd behavior, which unfortunately was a common charge at the time that was used against gay people, and his arrest brought a lot of attention to the Mattachine Society because Dale and the Mattachine Society fought the charges and won in a landmark case, which was a major victory for gay rights. So what exactly happened with Dale Jennings' arrest? Well, the story begins in a public bathroom, which is eerie when you think about it because of the anti-trans rhetoric we see today that often involves these bathroom-related arguments. But what's interesting is it was law enforcement who would create this setup to catch gay people. So the police officers would act as undercover gays and solicit sex, and then turn around and arrest people. So this is what happened to Dale Jennings. He stopped to use a public restroom at a park and was approached by another man who tried to get him to engage in sexual acts, but Jennings kept saying no until this undercover cop tried to forcibly get Jennings to engage with him, which at that point, he pulled out his badge and handcuffed Jennings. With regard to what happened next, Dale Jennings said, "I was forced to sit in the rear of a car on a dark street for almost an hour while 3 officers questioned me. It was a particularly effective type of grilling. They laughed a lot among themselves. Then in a sudden silence, one would ask, 'How long have you been this way?' I sat on my hands and wondered what would happen each time I refused to answer. Yes, I was scared stiff. At last, the driver started the car up. Having expected the usual beating before, now I was positive it was coming. Out in the country somewhere. They drove over a mile past the suburb of Lincoln Heights, then slowly doubled back. During this time, they repeatedly made jokes about police brutality, and each of the 3 instructed me to plead guilty and everything would be all right." What Jennings is referring to here when he talks about being driven out into the country and waiting for the beatings to happen, well, police brutality and beatings were very common when it came to arresting queer people during this time. Which this is the shit that always infuriates me like nothing else. The fact that queer people were being persecuted due to being so-called morally deviant when law enforcement was using entrapment tactics and intimidating and beating and threatening innocent people. Who's actually morally deviant here? You know, when y'all say, "What would Jesus do?" I didn't realize that meant driving an innocent person out into the country and using the power of your badge to brutally beat them. But you love Jesus, so you're morally superior. Fucking hypocrites. Sorry, you know, sometimes the feminine rage just pours out of me like lava. So Jennings winning this case was a huge victory for gay rights at the time. And the Mattachine Society was influential in the formation of LGBTQ rights and movements that came. So the Daughters of Bilitis was another organization to come out of the homophile movement, and it was the very first lesbian women's rights organization in the United States. The Daughters of Bilitis was founded in 1955 in San Francisco by couples Rose Bamberger and Rosemary Slipen. Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon, along with two other couples. And beautiful fun fact, Del Martin and Phyllis Lyon were the first couple to marry in the United States in San Francisco in 2004, even though the California Supreme Court invalidated their marriage a month later. So the Daughters of Bilitis was created to provide a space for lesbians to connect, to organize, and to advocate for their rights. It started as a safe alternative to the bar scene, which, as we know, at this time involved a lot of police raids. So the Daughters of Bilitis organized social events, educational programs, and support groups to empower lesbians and address the challenges they were facing. The name Daughters of Bilitis was inspired by the poetry of Pierre Louise, who was a French poet and writer who lived in the late 19th and 20th century. Bilitis was a fictional character named by Louise, who was a companion of our beloved Sappho. Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society often collaborated in their advocacy efforts, and at its peak, Daughters of Bilitis had 14 chapters, growing beyond San Francisco into cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, DC, and they also had a chapter open in Australia in Melbourne in 1969. One of the key initiatives of Daughters of Bilitis was the publication of The Ladder, which was a magazine that provided a platform for lesbian voices and perspectives, and it was in publication from 1956 to 1972. I'll post a link in the show notes where you can read volumes of The Ladder. It's really educational and eye-opening. There's poetry, there's day-in-the-life stories, anonymous reader letters, legal advice on how to interact with the police. There's a lot. Here's a little sampling. Here's a quote from Volume 1, Number 2 from 1956. "The salvation of the lesbian lies in her acceptance of herself without guilt or anxiety, in her awareness of her capabilities and her limitations, and in her pursuit of a constructive way of life without misgivings or apology. Don't listen to what they say. What do you say?" All right. I like it. Here's a Q&A with a reader from Volume 1, Number 4 in 1957 from reader TF in Seattle. TF writes, "This much I know. There is a need, a very strong need. But, there's that word again, what can one do about it in the face of prejudice, narrow-mindedness, head-in-the-sand attitude, and just plain chicken-heartedness?" So they respond back by saying, "Our answer is that we have college students, saleswomen, dental technicians, photographers, stenographers, teachers, traffic management people, etc., etc. Some are homeowners, some are saving for their future home, some are just living. We aren't just bar hoppers, but people with steady jobs, most of them good positions, and we all have faith that one day we will not be looked down upon if discovered, but that people will think that we are the same as they are, with the only personal difference of our sexual preference. We have said before, someone had to start this ball rolling, and so here we are. At the moment, we are all what might be termed white-collar workers, but we want all kinds, those who want help and those who wish to help. We are just honest, sincere people maintaining our own place in society, and we want to help others do the same. Will you help too?" So one of my biggest takeaways after reading a few volumes was just how deep the internalized homophobia ran in the 50s and how strong the hatred was towards us, how intense the societal conditioning was as a result, and just how unsafe it was to be queer. It's clear that there was definitely a theme of fitting in with societal norms for safety. They have articles from psychiatrists and psychologists at the time, and remember, homosexuality was a mental illness during this time. And those are pretty wild articles to go back and read and process. It's reading things like this that really speak to the fact that we have made a lot of progress and have come a long way, but that doesn't mean there isn't work to be done. And it speaks to the importance of not giving up the fight, because this is what the far right wants to bring back. But you can see this desire to blend in and prove how normal lesbians are hinted at in the last piece I read, where they say, we aren't bar hoppers, but people with steady jobs. And they say, we're white collar. It's about fitting in. And this ideology really perpetuated racism within these early movements. And we can't forget that. So it's important to bring up and not repeat history and to address the white supremacy here, because it's the same white supremacy that allows for things like genocide to continue. In volume 1, number 5, there's a piece from a psychologist by the name of Dr. Albert Ellis, who talks about his 2 theories of ways to combat anti-homosexual culture. I'll read it so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. So remember, this is from 1957. The article is called "The U.S. Has an Anti-Homosexual Culture." So at first read, it's like, okay, it seems bold for 1957. All right, let's see where this goes. So Dr. Ellis listed the 2 ways to combat anti-homosexual culture as the palliative method and the curative method. He believes the first to be the most practical, but the second, the most sure in results. The following is an outline of these 2 methods. So first we have the palliative method. And the palliative method operates under 3 principles. Number 1, social sexual conditions will continue as they are today. Number 2, homosexuals will continue to exist. And number 3, heterosexuals will continue to penalize homosexuals. So he says to combat this situation using the palliative method, the homosexual should, 1, remain a law-abiding, responsible citizen. 2, abhor all feelings and actions showing superiority. 3, refrain from flaunting their sex preference in public. Number 4, avoid over-clannishness. Number 5, resist in-group favoritism and avoid sticking up for people merely because they are homosexual. Number 6, accept the realities of life and avoid self-pity. Okay. 7, it's getting worse. I'm just warning you. 7, help police his own group. Remember, this is advice from a psychologist. Number 8, try in a dignified way to effect changes in the laws. Number 9, try to express protest to the public on discrimination against the homosexual and to correct misinformation in the public's mind. Number 10, try to remain undogmatic about homosexuality. Keep an open mind and keep up with the recent findings in the field. Be able to accept facts which may be contrary to his own beliefs of pro-homosexual bias. Dr. Ellis feels that the best this method could hope to accomplish would be a lessening of antagonism. It would not bring about maximum results. Okay, what did you think about the palliative method? These suggestions are basically to conform and hide, and to give it the old bootstrap theory and pick yourself up and stop complaining. It's basically stay silent to survive. If it's not in their faces, if you try not to exist, they won't antagonize you. How sad. All right, here's the next part. This next method, he believes, would bring about maximum results, but in order to do this would entail a complete revision of the sexual thoughts of all Americans. He calls it a futuristic and utopian method. However, he states his belief that the day will come, in several centuries perhaps, when people will not scorn, persecute, or jail the homosexual. Wow. Several centuries. Okay, so he says the curative method looks to that day. The curative method and what can be done about it now. Number 1, combat Puritanism and anti-sexual attitudes of all. Okay, I can get on board with this. Number 2, promulgate scientific facts. Okay. 3, sponsor scientific research. 4, the homosexual can combat unfair sanctions by attacking their own exclusive sanctions toward the heterosexual, by ruthlessly attacking unscientific attitudes and admitting that they are not born homosexual, but are in some way emotionally disturbed and could be cured to some degree. And then number 5, stop being pro-homosexual and just be pro-sexual. Okay, so at first I was rooting for this theory, but after hearing all 5 qualifiers, not so much. It's still operating under this idea that there's something biologically or chemically different. So we could technically cure it. Any scientific research on marginalized communities to me always screams eugenics and white supremacy and just all the bad, evil stuff. But here's the alchemy involved with the latter publishing these pieces with psychologists. One of the things I love is that Barbara Giddings, who became the editor of the latter from 1963 to 1966, wasn't just about fitting in. She was more radical, and she really emphasized the importance of activism and advocacy and encouraged readers to engage in the fight for their rights. So Barbara Giddings was actually one of the advocates who fought to remove homosexuality from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental disorders, which was a huge win for our community. So when we look at these earlier movements like Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society, we can see that the silencing and trying to fly under the radar really led to Stonewall. There was a lot of buildup. Stonewall wasn't about blending in. It was about fighting back. People were tired of just playing hush-hush and being oppressed. They were sick and tired of the police brutality. They were ready to fight. So if you're listening and not super familiar with what happened at Stonewall, brief rundown here. On June 28th, 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn in New York City. And as we know, this was common during that time. But during this raid, law enforcement was particularly aggressive with Stonewall patrons. And people just had it at this point. People typically just complied or ran away, but not this time. They decided to fight back. They were burning it all down, overturning police vehicles, finally fighting back. The riots lasted for several nights, and more people from the community and allies came to show solidarity and support. So Stonewall resulted in the LGBTQ community in New York City beginning to organize more formally. 2 prominent groups emerged following Stonewall, the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activists Alliance. And because of the media attention, Stonewall brought a lot of visibility to the movement. The visibility and activism that followed Stonewall led to increased fight for legal rights and anti-discrimination protections. So Stonewall is really noted as the event that changed everything, that really sparked change within the movement because it's one of the first times people fought back. And again, media coverage, no different than what's happening in Gaza. For the first time, people were able to see with their very eyes the impact of criminalizing the queer community. And it started to shift the perspectives of some. So this year for Pride, we have to consider what led us to Pride. The parades we throw in the streets, those are sacred symbols of the protests and work of political activists. We have to remember what Pride is rooted in. We must consider the parallels between the Pride movement and the movement we see today for liberation for Palestine and all oppressed people. And this year, more than ever, as we face increased hatred and bigotry and opposition of our community, as we see these horrific laws being proposed, we can't let our guard down. This work is sacred. Pride is sacred. Activism is sacred. And I think that's really why I was struggling with Pride this year in particular. We can't be complacent. The history or herstory we covered today, it's a tiny little chunk of history. And now is the time to educate ourselves and learn from those who came before us. So when we're hanging up our Pride flag or wearing our Pride gear, let's take a moment to remember why. Pride is resistance. Pride is radical. Pride is a movement for liberation, and we need that now more than ever. We are living in times of change and revolution, and to be queer is revolutionary. It's a lived resistance to these systems that are destroying the world. Feel that for a moment. Feel the power in that. We're here to change the world. I truly believe that. So happy Pride to everyone. I love you all, and I am just so proud to be a part of this community. I'll see y'all next week.